Officer Jason Carter sat in his patrol car, the hum of the engine barely noticeable beneath the constant thrum of the city outside. It was late, and the streets of this neighborhood, notorious for its crime rates, were dark and winding. The streetlights flickered sporadically, casting brief moments of clarity on the otherwise shadowy sidewalks. This area had a reputation, one that weighed heavily on Jason's mind as he drove slowly through the narrow streets. He was no stranger to the feeling of tension that followed him in neighborhoods like this. It was practically a part of his uniform at this point, settling over him with the same weight as his badge and gun. The radio crackled to life with occasional bursts of static, reminding him of the ever-present reality of his job. Anything could happen at any moment. Jason had been on the force for nearly 10 years now, and if he had learned anything, it was that complacency was a dangerous luxury. His eyes constantly scanned the road, the sidewalks, the shadows between buildings. He didn't need a call to know that danger could be lurking just beyond his line of sight. Every noise, every flicker of movement demanded his attention, and though the night had been uneventful so far, his body remained tense, like a coil wound too tight. The city never truly slept, and neither could he. Not here, not tonight. As Jason made a slow turn down a side street, something caught his eye. Up ahead, a sleek black sedan approached an intersection. The windows were heavily tinted, obscuring any view inside. Jason's instincts kicked in immediately. Tinted windows weren't uncommon, especially in areas like this, where privacy seemed to be a coveted commodity. But something about the way the car moved, slightly too slow and deliberate, caught his attention. His gaze sharpened as the car rolled through the stop sign without so much as a pause. It wasn't a flagrant violation, but it was enough. Jason flipped on his lights, the red and blue reflections dancing off the nearby buildings as his car picked up speed to catch up with the vehicle. He radioed in the stop, his voice steady, though he felt the familiar churn of adrenaline start to creep in. As he pulled the car over to the side of the road, his mind raced with possibilities. He had no idea who or what was waiting for him inside that sedan, but he knew he had to approach it like he did every other stop, cautiously, prepared for anything. The car's engine idled quietly, almost too quietly, as Jason exited his patrol car. His hand rested near his holster, a natural position after years on the job, though he didn't expect to need it. Still, you never knew. He had learned long ago that what seemed like a routine traffic stop could quickly spiral into something far more dangerous. His boots crunched on the pavement as he made his way toward the driver's side window, every step measured and deliberate. He couldn't shake the unease that crawled up his spine, though he tried to push it aside. After all, this could be nothing more than a minor infraction, a simple ticket, and he'd be back on his patrol in no time. When he reached the window, Jason tapped lightly on the glass, signaling the driver to roll it down. For a moment, nothing happened. His nerves prickled, and he felt the weight of the quiet night press down on him. Then slowly the window lowered, and Jason found himself face to face with someone he never expected to see. Dr. Nia Thompson was instantly recognizable even before Jason fully processed what he was seeing. She was a prominent figure, known throughout the city and beyond for her work as a judge and a fierce advocate for social justice. Her name had been in the news countless times, her speeches and rulings often igniting debates about race, inequality, and the role of law enforcement. Jason had seen her face on TV, heard her voice in interviews, but he had never expected to meet her like this, under these circumstances. For a split second, Jason froze, unsure how to proceed. This wasn't just any driver. This was someone who could upend his entire career with a single phone call. His mind raced, trying to grasp the gravity of the situation. He had pulled over a powerful and influential figure, someone who was not only deeply knowledgeable about the law, but also highly critical of the very system he represented. "Good evening, officer," Judge Thompson said, her voice calm and composed, though there was a subtle tension in her words. Her hands rested on the steering wheel, her posture relaxed but controlled. There was a quiet confidence about her, the kind that came from years of standing up to authority and winning. She knew the rules, probably better than he did, and that knowledge hung in the air between them, unspoken but undeniable. Jason cleared his throat, trying to maintain his composure. "Ma'am, do you know why I pulled you over?" Judge Thompson glanced briefly at the stop sign she had rolled through, then back at him, her expression unreadable. "I believe I may have missed the stop sign back there," she said, not offering an apology, just a simple acknowledgement of the facts. "Is that correct?" Jason nodded, his mind still spinning. He had to follow protocol, had to treat this like any other stop, but the power dynamics at play were impossible to ignore. Here he was, an officer in uniform, standing over one of the city's most prominent judges, someone who had dedicated her life to challenging the very institution he was sworn to uphold. The weight of the moment pressed down on him like a vice. "Yes, ma'am," he said, his voice steady, though inside he was anything but calm. "You did roll through the stop sign, and I'll need to see your license and registration, please." Judge Thompson complied, reaching into her glove compartment without hesitation. As she handed him the documents, her eyes never left his, and Jason couldn't help but feel like he was being assessed, judged in a way that went far beyond this simple traffic stop. "You're Officer Carter, correct?" she asked, her tone still measured. But now there was something more. An edge, perhaps. Jason stiffened slightly, surprised that she knew his name. "Yes, ma'am. That's correct." Judge Thompson's gaze didn't waver. "I've heard your name before. I believe you were involved in a recent case. Something to do with excessive force?" Jason's heart skipped a beat. The case she referred to had been controversial, to say the least, and though he had been cleared of any wrongdoing, the public perception had been less forgiving. His face had been on the news for weeks, his name dragged through the mud in debates about police brutality and the abuse of power. "That's right," Jason said, trying to keep his voice neutral. "I was cleared in that case." Judge Thompson gave a small nod, as though filing the information away. "I see." The silence that followed was thick with unspoken tension. Jason knew this was no ordinary traffic stop. This was a test, a moment that could spiral into something much larger depending on his next move. The following morning, Jason Carter woke up to the sound of his phone buzzing incessantly on the nightstand. Groggy and disoriented, he reached for it, only to be met with a flood of notifications. Missed calls, text messages, social media alerts. His phone was lighting up in a way that it hadn't in months, not since the last major incident involving his name had hit the news. A sense of dread settled over him as he swiped through the notifications, his mind already piecing together what had happened. It didn't take long for him to find the video. There it was, plastered all over social media, already shared thousands of times, a short, shaky recording of his interaction with Judge Nia Thompson from the night before. Someone must have been recording from their window or a nearby car, capturing the whole thing. The moment he pulled her over, the calm way she handed him her license, and most damning of all, the brief but loaded exchange about his previous involvement in the excessive force case. The video had gone viral overnight. News outlets had already picked it up, and social media was ablaze with commentary. Some were calling it yet another example of racial profiling, pointing out how quickly he had escalated what could have been a routine stop into something far more fraught with tension. Others focused on the power dynamics, highlighting how a white officer pulling over a prominent black judge was emblematic of the larger systemic issues plaguing law enforcement. Jason's stomach twisted as he read the headlines. "Officer involved in controversial case pulls over prominent judge, racial profiling or routine stop." Caught on camera, tense exchange between police and civil rights advocate Judge Nia Thompson. The comments were even worse. People were demanding answers, calling for him to be fired, demanding justice for what they saw as yet another instance of abuse of power. Some of the more radical voices were even threatening protests. Jason felt the walls closing in, his pulse quickening with every new notification. It wasn't just strangers commenting, though. His fellow officers were texting him too, some offering support, others warning him about what was coming. He scrolled through the messages, his mind racing as he tried to figure out what to do next. The department was going to see this soon, if they hadn't already. His superiors would be calling him in, and he wasn't sure how to handle it. But what weighed on him the most wasn't the public backlash. It was the fact that Judge Thompson had shared the video herself. She had posted it on her personal social media account, accompanied by a measured, thoughtful statement about the incident. In her post, she didn't accuse him outright of racial profiling, but she framed the encounter as part of a broader conversation about the relationship between law enforcement and marginalized communities. She wrote about the importance of accountability, about how even routine traffic stops could be charged with the weight of history and inequality. She didn't paint herself as a victim, but she didn't let him off the hook either. Jason felt a surge of defensiveness rise within him. He hadn't done anything wrong, at least not technically. He had followed protocol. The stop was legal. She had rolled through the stop sign, and he had acted accordingly. But deep down, beneath the layers of self-justification, he couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that this was more complicated than that. The way she had looked at him during the stop, the way she had invoked his past case, it had rattled him more than he cared to admit. Hours later, Jason found himself sitting in the office of Lieutenant Daniels, his direct superior, who was staring at him with a mixture of frustration and concern. The video had reached the precinct, and now Jason was in damage control mode, trying to explain his side of the story. "Look, Carter," Lieutenant Daniels said, rubbing his temples, "this is a mess. I don't need to tell you that. The department's getting flooded with calls. We're getting pressure from the community, from the mayor's office, from every direction. People are saying this is a textbook case of racial profiling, and now they're digging up your past." Jason shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his hands clenched into fists in his lap. "I didn't profile her," he said, his voice tight. "She ran the stop sign. I followed protocol." Daniels leaned forward, his expression hardening. "I don't care if you followed protocol, Carter. That's not the point right now. The point is, this looks bad. Really bad. And in this climate, appearances matter just as much as reality. You pulled over one of the most high-profile judges in the city, a judge who's been outspoken about police reform, and now this whole thing is blowing up in our faces." Jason opened his mouth to protest, but Daniels cut him off. "I'm not saying you did anything wrong, not officially, but you have to understand, this is bigger than you. This is about the department's reputation. We can't afford another scandal, especially not with everything going on right now. The public is demanding accountability, and they're not going to let this go." Jason's chest tightened. He felt like he was being suffocated by forces beyond his control. "So, what are you saying? What do you want me to do?" Daniels sighed, leaning back in his chair. "The chief wants you to lay low for a while. We're putting you on administrative leave until we can get ahead of this thing. We need to show that we're taking this seriously." Jason's stomach dropped. Administrative leave. It wasn't the first time, but it felt different this time, more final. "And after that?" he asked quietly. Daniels shrugged, though there was a flicker of sympathy in his eyes. "We'll see. It depends on how things play out, but right now, you need to get out of the spotlight." Jason nodded, though every part of him rebelled against the idea. He wasn't a rookie. He knew how these things worked. Lay low, let the public outrage blow over, and hope you didn't become the next scapegoat. But this time, it felt like more than just a temporary setback. This felt like the beginning of the end. As he left Daniel's office, Jason couldn't shake the feeling of isolation that clung to him. He had always prided himself on his ability to handle pressure, to stay calm under fire. But now the weight of it all was crushing him. The public scrutiny, the media attention, the protests that were already being planned, it was all spiraling out of control. And in the middle of it all was Judge Thompson, calm, composed, and utterly unshakable. Jason couldn't stop thinking about her, about the way she had looked at him during the stop, like she had seen right through him, like she knew something about him that even he wasn't willing to admit. He had spent his entire career trying to convince himself that he was one of the good guys, that he was on the right side of the law, but now he wasn't so sure. Later that night, Jason sat at home, the dim glow of the TV casting flickering shadows across the room. The news anchors were discussing the incident, dissecting every second of the video, analyzing his every move. He barely heard their words. His mind was elsewhere, caught in a whirlwind of doubt and anger. He had done everything by the book, hadn't he? He hadn't treated her any differently than he would have treated anyone else. But maybe that was the problem. Maybe it wasn't just about following the rules. Maybe it was about something deeper, something that went beyond the surface of the traffic stop, beyond the letter of the law. As the night dragged on, Jason felt the isolation grow. The walls of his house seemed to close in on him, the silence pressing down on his chest like a weight. He didn't know what to do next, didn't know how to fix this, or if it even could be fixed. One thing was clear, though. This wasn't just about a traffic stop anymore. This was about who he was and the choices he had made, choices that were now coming back to haunt him, whether he was ready to face them or not. The protest began quietly at first, with a few scattered groups gathering outside the police precinct. Signs were raised, slogans chanted, and the demands were clear: accountability, justice, reform. Jason Carter watched it all unfold from the relative safety of his home, his eyes glued to the news coverage. What started as a small group of activists quickly swelled into a movement that caught fire across social media. Judge Nia Thompson's post had been the spark, but now it was a wildfire, fueled by years of pent-up frustration with the police, with the system, with everything Jason had sworn to protect. He watched as protesters marched through the streets, their voices echoing through the city. The signs they carried bore messages like "End racial profiling" and "Justice for all." They chanted for change, their faces a mix of anger, hope, and determination. It wasn't just about him anymore. This had become a flashpoint for the larger conversation about policing in America. Jason felt a deep, gnawing discomfort as he realized how much bigger this had grown than a single traffic stop. Social media was ablaze with hashtags calling for his resignation. News outlets were covering the protests, interviewing activists, community leaders, and even celebrities who were lending their voices to the cause. The narrative had shifted, and Jason's name was now synonymous with the very issues he had spent his career trying to distance himself from. Every time he heard his name on the news, it was accompanied by words like racism, abuse of power, and systemic injustice. His phone buzzed constantly, messages pouring in from every direction. Some were from fellow officers offering support or warning him to keep his head down. Others were from people he hadn't heard from in years, their words less than kind. The online threats became more frequent, some directed at him, others at his family. The tension was suffocating. He tried to turn it all off, to focus on anything else, but there was no escaping it. The city, the country, had latched onto this story, and now it was consuming his life. At work, things were no better. His administrative leave kept him away from the precinct, but he heard through the grapevine how divided his colleagues were. Some supported him, saying he had done nothing wrong, that he had simply followed procedure. Others, however, weren't so sure. The video had sparked conversations that hadn't been had openly in the precinct before, about race, about how officers treated certain communities, and about whether the department was doing enough to address these issues. Jason had always prided himself on being one of the good guys, but now that identity felt fragile, crumbling under the weight of public scrutiny. His wife, Emily, tried to shield him from the worst of it, but even she was feeling the strain. The stares at the grocery store, the whispers when she picked up their kids from school. It was all becoming too much. Jason could see the stress in her eyes, the worry that she tried to hide for the sake of their family. But the tension between them was growing, and they both knew it. Emily had always been supportive of his career, but now that support was faltering. There were things they hadn't talked about, things she hadn't questioned. Until now. The turning point came one evening after the kids had gone to bed. Jason sat at the kitchen table, nursing a beer, when Emily finally confronted him. She had been quiet all day, but now the silence between them felt like a chasm, impossible to ignore. "Jason," she said, her voice softer than usual but laced with tension. "We need to talk about what's happening. About everything." He looked up at her, already knowing where this conversation was headed. "I know," he said, his voice weary. "I've been trying to figure it all out." Emily sat down across from him, folding her hands on the table. "It's not just the protests or the media. It's us. I don't know if I can keep pretending like everything's okay, like you haven't been different. Something's changed, and I'm scared of where this is going." Jason felt his chest tighten. "What do you mean? I'm still me, Emily. I'm doing my job, trying to get through this. She shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. But that's the problem, Jason. It's not just about doing your job anymore. You've changed since that case with Devin. It's like you've become someone else. Someone who's more concerned about protecting the department than doing what's right. I've seen you shut down, and I didn't say anything because I thought you were just coping, but now I can't ignore it anymore. Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. The mention of Devin, his childhood friend who had been a victim of police brutality, reopened a wound he had buried deep inside. Devin had been like a brother to him, and when the police had assaulted him during a routine stop, Jason had been furious until he joined the force himself. Over the years, he had convinced himself that what happened to Devin was an anomaly, a mistake that didn't reflect the whole system. But now, with everything unraveling around him, he wasn't so sure anymore. I didn't want this, Em, Jason said, his voice thick with emotion. I didn't want any of this to happen. I thought I was doing the right thing, following the rules, but now, I don't know anymore. It's like everything I believed in is being torn apart, and I don't know how to fix it. Emily reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. I know you didn't want this, Jason, but you can't keep running from it. You have to face it, all of it. You have to figure out who you are, who you want to be. Jason stared down at their hands, his mind swirling with memories of Devin, of the night he had pulled over Judge Thompson, of the protests that had erupted because of him. He had spent so long trying to be the kind of cop who didn't get caught up in politics, who just did his job and went home. But now he realized that wasn't enough. He couldn't hide behind his badge anymore. He had to confront the ugly truths he had been avoiding. The next morning, Jason sat alone in his car, parked outside his childhood home. It had been years since he had visited, since he had really thought about the place where he and Devin had grown up together. The memories flooded back. Playing basketball in the driveway, sneaking out at night to explore the neighborhood, dreaming about the future. They had been inseparable once, brothers in all but blood. But that had all changed the night Devin had been beaten by the police. Jason had been powerless to stop it, just a bystander watching as his best friend was brutalized for no reason other than being in the wrong place at the wrong time. After that, everything had fallen apart. Devin had withdrawn, moved away, and Jason had buried the pain deep, telling himself that it was an isolated incident, that things would get better. Now, sitting in his car, Jason realized how much he had betrayed the memory of his friend by turning a blind eye to the very system that had hurt him. He hadn't visited Devin in years, hadn't reached out to see how he was doing. And now, in the midst of the biggest crisis of his career, he felt the weight of that neglect. Jason pulled out his phone and dialed Devin's number. It rang twice before going to voicemail, and Jason hesitated for a moment before leaving a message. Hey, Devin, it's Jason. I know it's been a long time, and I'm sorry for that. I don't even know if you'll want to hear from me, but I need to talk to you. I've been doing a lot of thinking, and I realize I've made some mistakes. I hope you'll give me a chance to make things right. Call me back when you can. He hung up, his heart heavy with guilt and regret. The journey toward accountability and change wouldn't be easy, and Jason knew it would take more than just an apology to fix the damage that had been done. Not just to Devin, but to his community, his family, and himself. As he drove away from his childhood home, the protests continued to grow, and the city remained in turmoil. But for the first time in a long while, Jason felt like he was taking the first step towards something better, even if he didn't yet know what that was. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew that ignoring the problem wasn't an option anymore. He would have to face it head-on, starting with the people he had hurt most. The road ahead was uncertain, and the path to redemption, if it existed, would be long. But Jason was ready to begin. The days after Jason's call to Devin were some of the longest of his life. He found himself stuck in a state of limbo, waiting for a response that might never come. Devin hadn't called back, and though Jason hadn't expected immediate forgiveness, or any at all, the silence was still a heavy reminder of how much he had let his childhood friend down. But it wasn't just about Devin anymore. Jason's entire world felt as though it was spinning off its axis. He had once found comfort in the predictability of his role, the routines of being a cop, but now even those were crumbling. Every day brought new challenges as protests intensified and the public's anger boiled over. The headlines no longer just mentioned his name in passing. They were now scrutinizing his entire career, dragging up old cases, questioning his past actions, and shining a light on every decision he had ever made. The sense of control Jason had once held tightly was slipping through his fingers, and it terrified him. As the days wore on, Jason found himself retreating inward, grappling with questions he'd never truly faced before. He thought about his years on the force, how he'd convinced himself that as long as he followed the rules, he was on the right side. But now, with the weight of public scrutiny pressing down on him, he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that the rules themselves might be part of the problem. Had he been so focused on doing what was expected of him that he had lost sight of what was truly right? One afternoon, unable to sit in his own thoughts any longer, Jason decided to visit a part of the city he hadn't been to in years. An old community center where he and Devin used to spend hours playing basketball as kids. It had been the heart of their neighborhood back then, a place where everyone knew each other, where the community felt tight-knit and strong. He remembered those days with a mix of fondness and guilt. Things had seemed so simple then, so full of promise. As he approached the center, he noticed how much had changed. The building was still standing, but the once vibrant murals had faded, and the park nearby, where children used to play, was now overgrown and neglected. The basketball court where he and Devin had once spent entire summers was cracked and abandoned, the backboard leaning precariously to one side, barely attached to the rusty pole. The sight of it made Jason's heart ache with nostalgia and regret. He stood there for a long time, taking in the quiet, desolate scene. In many ways, it mirrored how he felt, hollowed out, worn down by time and neglect. It was in this moment, staring at the broken remains of his childhood, that he realized just how far he had drifted from the values he had once held so dearly. Jason thought about Devin again, about how their paths had diverged. After the incident with the police years ago, Devin had moved away, cut ties, and built a life elsewhere. Jason, on the other hand, had joined the very institution that had caused his friends so much pain. And though he had told himself for years that he had done it to make a difference from the inside, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had failed. Failed Devin, failed his community, and failed himself. As Jason stood there, lost in thought, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, expecting another flood of notifications, but instead, his heart skipped a beat when he saw the name on the screen. Devin. For a moment, Jason hesitated, his thumb hovering over the answer button. He wasn't sure if he was ready for this conversation, if he was ready to confront the years of silence and hurt that had built up between them, but deep down, he knew he couldn't run from it any longer. Taking a deep breath, Jason answered the call. "Hey, Jason," Devin's voice came through the line, slightly muffled but unmistakable. There was a pause, an awkward silence that hung in the air between them. Jason could feel the weight of their shared history pressing down on him. "Devin," Jason finally said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thanks for calling me back." Another pause, and then Devin spoke again, his tone guarded but not hostile. "I wasn't sure I would, to be honest. It's been a long time." Jason nodded even though Devin couldn't see him. "I know. I'm sorry. I should have reached out sooner. I should have been there for you after everything." Devin let out a slow breath, and Jason could almost hear him weighing his words carefully. "Yeah, you should have." The truth in those words stung, but Jason didn't try to defend himself. He knew there was no point in offering excuses. "I know," he said quietly. "I don't expect you to forgive me for that, but I need you to know that I'm trying to make things right now. I don't know if I can, but I'm trying." Devin didn't respond right away, and Jason braced himself for whatever was coming next. But when Devin spoke again, his voice was softer, less guarded. "I saw what's happening with you in the news. The protests, the video, everything. I wasn't sure what to think at first, but it got me thinking. About you, about us, about what happened all those years ago." Jason swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion. "I've been thinking about it too, Devin. A lot. I joined the force thinking I could make a difference. But now I'm not so sure. It feels like I've been part of the problem all along." For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence filled with the weight of years of unspoken words. Then Devin sighed. It's not all on you, Jason. The system's broken. Yeah, but it's not like you built it yourself. The question is, what are you going to do about it now? Jason felt a surge of relief at Devin's words, even though the question itself was daunting. I don't know, Jason admitted, his voice raw with vulnerability. But I want to start by making things right with you. I know I can't fix the past, but maybe we can figure out where to go from here. Together. Devin was silent for a long moment, and Jason held his breath, waiting for his response. Finally, Devin spoke, his tone softer than before. Maybe, but it's gonna take more than just a conversation, Jason. You've got a lot of work to do. I know, Jason said, nodding, even though Devin couldn't see him. I'm ready to do the work. I don't want to keep running from this. From you. From everything. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then Devin spoke again, his voice firm but not unkind. All right, let's start with this. Meet me tomorrow. Let's talk, face to face. We've got a lot to sort through. Jason felt a rush of gratitude. I'll be there, he said, his voice steady with resolve. Whatever it takes. After hanging up, Jason sat in his car for a long time, staring at the crumbling basketball court in front of him. It wasn't a resolution, not yet, but it was a start. For the first time in years, he felt like he was taking a step in the right direction. The next day, Jason arrived at a small cafe just outside the city, a place Devin had suggested. It was quiet, tucked away from the hustle and bustle of downtown, and Jason appreciated the anonymity it offered. He had spent weeks being scrutinized by the public, and the thought of having this conversation in a place where no one was watching felt like a relief. When Devin walked through the door, Jason almost didn't recognize him at first. The years had changed them both, but it was the look in Devin's eyes that struck Jason the most. There was a hardness there, a guardedness that hadn't been there when they were kids. But there was also something else, a flicker of the connection they had once shared, buried beneath the layers of time and pain. They sat down across from each other, the awkwardness of the moment hanging in the air. Neither of them seemed to know how to start, but finally Jason spoke. I'm really sorry, Devin, Jason said, his voice low but sincere. For everything. For not being there when you needed me. For joining the force after what happened to you. I should have stood by you, but I didn't. Devin nodded, his expression unreadable. I was angry for a long time, Jason. After what happened, I didn't know who to trust anymore. And when you became a cop, it felt like you'd chosen a side, and it wasn't mine. Jason flinched at the truth in Devin's words, but he didn't shy away from it. I thought I could change things from the inside, he said, his voice quiet but firm. But now I see that maybe I was just fooling myself. Devin sighed, leaning back in his chair. Maybe. But the fact that you're here now, that says something. I don't know if it's enough, but it's a start. Jason nodded, feeling a tentative hope stir in his chest. I don't know where this is going to lead, but I want to do better. I want to be better. For you, for me, for everyone. Devin met his gaze, and for the first time in years, Jason saw a flicker of the old friendship they once had. We'll see, Jason. It's a long road ahead. And with that, they began to talk, really talk, about the past, the present, and the uncertain future that lay ahead. It wasn't a resolution, but it was a beginning. And for Jason, that was enough to keep moving forward.